Hi, this is MJ Schwab. I wanted to talk about, I'm going to deal mostly with the Freedom Trail sites, or some of them anyway. But what I really wanted to talk about was um, outdoor history on the historical locations. History books are great. They really are. I love history books. But I think if you can touch history to actually live history, or some semblance of it anyway, I think that's how you learn history the best. Students learn history, especially young students, learn history the best by touching it essentially. So museums, archives, to touch the actual history is paramount in early learning of history. It make it much more interesting for them, the youngsters especially, but even kids in middle school and high school. And that made me think about when I was in elementary school, what places would interest me most. And it was all, I grew up in Northwest Indiana, and we had this place called Pioneer, or Conner Prairie Pioneer Settlement. And it would show you how to live in the pioneer days. People would interpret, and I even do that today at Pioneer Living History Museum here in Arizona. There, I volunteer occasionally, and I sometimes play banker, sometimes an 1880s banker in the Old West. Sometimes I play a miner and grow my beard out, which I'm starting to right now because I'm going to be playing a miner soon. And I the kids, they come in by the busloads and they learn a ton, and that's what they do on the Freedom Trail, the pub crawl, all kinds of things. Where you actually visit these pubs uh, in Boston. And I remember when I was a kid and I went on my family vacations, and Lexington and Concord, and of course Gettysburg for the Civil War were some of my favorite places. But I also love Boston. Um, and I love old church architecture, mostly Victorian, but and Victorian houses as well. And so the architecture always interested me. And so the Second Street, or I'm sorry, Park Street Church was one that I always enjoyed. It was built in 1809, and it's so old. The ones that I've seen, like in the Chicago area, the churches, or especially here in Phoenix, which is, they're not old at all. But most of those are from the mid late 1800s. This is from the early 1800s, and I always love. I remember, as a kid, seeing that, and the Old South Meeting House. Of course, a lot of people know that one. The the actually, we might not even be seeing that now, and then that's something about preservation. It's just as important as outdoor history, learning from history that you can touch, but preservation. In 1872, the Old South Meeting House could have been turned into rubble, would have been torn down if not for a women's group, 20 dedicated women that saved the building. Maintenance to buildings, all these things go into, history. Preserving history needs money, and that's very important. And I know that from working at the Pioneer Living History Museum. We've got old replica buildings, and some of them are original buildings that we had to move on site. And the maintenance, so we have even extra maintenance on top of normal maintenance, where we moved these buildings that are, over 100 years old, 130, 140 years old in some cases. And so it takes money, and volunteers, and these people who volunteer, from people who run the sites to, and people who are being paid, of course, and to people like myself who volunteer as an interpreter, playing a banker or a miner, my favorite. And these dedicated people bring history alive. They understand the history and they take it seriously too. I have to admit, I didn't know a ton about that period of the Old West, but I had to learn, and I learned it quickly. and that's what these people do at these public history sites in and around Boston and all over New England, all over the East Coast, really. Around Lynchburg, of course, there are many sites, mostly Civil War sites, um, yeah, public history is very important. Um, but and then saving it, like I said, with the Meeting House. The one final thing I wanted to talk about is Bunker Hill. That was the thing that became that was the most important or of the sites for me around the Boston area. Bunker Hill was actually the most of the battle was fought on Breed's Hill. Uh, a An English lieutenant had mixed up the two hills, and so interesting thing of history about that. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a revolutionary hero who died on Bunker Hill, and he's an interesting subject because a lot of people refer to him as possibly he could have been the more of a political leader for the young United States. Maybe perhaps even supplanting George Washington as our first president. And he's an interesting one to look through. Anyway, in the Bunker Hill Museum, they actually have some of his artifacts. They have a Masonic apron of his. And so that's really interesting. So the history can come alive both outside and inside in the museums. And but especially outside, this is how the children learn by touching it and by touching history and learning that way. So thank you.